On the first day of the deployment of German soldiers in Africa, heavy and light anti-aircraft batteries of the Luftwaffe participated in all the battles. One of the first units was the 1st Division of Flak Regiment 33. The transport of weapons, equipment, and personnel was carried out by ship from Naples. Among the soldiers of this unit was young Private Arnold Huebner. This soldier would make a name for himself in Africa over the next few months and contribute to the glory of the 1st Division of Flak Regiment 33. Arnold Huebner was called up for the Reich Labor Service after completing his apprenticeship on April 1, 1939. From there, he volunteered for the Luftwaffe for the outbreak of the war. In September, he joined the Luftwaffe and underwent basic training in the Flak Replacement Detachment 11 in Stettin. From there, he was able to visit his hometown and reunite with his parents, who were overjoyed to see him again. On September 1, 1940, he was promoted to private and 4 days later transferred to the 3rd Battery of Flak Regiment 33. A few months later, this unit was designated to be the first air unit to be deployed to Africa, where the newly formed German Afrika Korps under General Rommel had landed. In February 1941, while marching to Stettin and Berlin, the soldiers of the unit were provided with tropical uniforms, while the surrounding landscape was covered in deep snow. So, they were indeed going to Africa. As the drums in the bush had announced a few days earlier, the crossing took place from Naples, and on the 3rd day, the ship was attacked by a British submarine, but both torpedoes missed their target. The troop transport arrived in the port of Tripoli the following night. Huebner later reported with special enthusiasm, "After unloading, we were supposed to pass by General Rommel. In the late afternoon, the vehicles set in motion and drove out of the harbor, passing by General Rommel, who had not missed the opportunity to welcome his first anti-aircraft soldiers. Then they continued straight to the front. After 2 days of travel, the unit reached the Sirte airfield and took over their flak positions there. On the same day, a British reconnaissance plane that had flown over the area was shot down. This was the first success of the 1st Division of Flak Regiment 33. Shortly thereafter, a reconnaissance unit was assigned to the 3rd Battery. The battery was alerted, and the heavily laden vehicles made their way through the sand, as all the bridges and dry riverbeds had been blown up by the enemy on the Via Balbia. But they reached the front line close to the sea and took up positions for air, sea, and ground target shooting. The guns had to be buried in the sand up to their ears. Together with his comrades from the Anton gun, for which he was the gunner, Huebner had to help with the construction of the position. Officer Heinzel, the manager of Anton, cursed that he had been degraded to a mole. In the first few days, everything was quiet until a British fighter plane approached the position at an altitude of only 800 meters with its engine throttled. It was received with a barrage of shells, and the aircraft was hit and landed not far from the battery. It was a courier plane from London that had been shot down after a stopover in Malta, carrying mail for the British troops in Africa. On March 31, 1941, after the initial skirmishes of both sides' reconnaissance advances, the first German offensive in Africa began. 2 guns from the 3rd Battery stormed ahead from the vehicle under the leadership of Captain Fromm, along with Reconnaissance Detachment 3 and Major Fried Freiherr von Bachelor. They fired on the enemy from there. All 4 guns of the 3rd Battery made it through and took up positions. From here, the 3rd Battery fired on an enemy village where enemy artillery was located. They shot them out of their fighting positions, but the British had meanwhile upgraded and returned fire. The 3rd Battery had to change positions. Suddenly, a Skyriter bomber appeared, but the batteries successfully changed positions, and in the evening, the infantry also arrived. The occupied village was captured by them in a night attack. Thus, the advance towards Tobruk, ordered by Rommel, began. The 3rd Battery was placed under the command of Battle Group Strike. They fought for 10 days in the Sidi Aziz area against British artillery, and survived several tank attacks. The battery was now commanded by First Lieutenant Herbert von Paulwitz, who had been appointed commander of the 1st Company. The orders to advance with his battery on the L-208, which lay exactly between Kapuz and Sidi Aziz, were followed. The high positions were expanded by Italian engineers. While the battery was working hard at the back entrance, within 24 hours the guns were installed so that only their barrels protruded beyond the parapet. On June 28, 1941, in the early morning hours, the guards on Hill 208 Southeast heard tank noises. With the first shot, Huebner climbed onto his 88 and searched the desert in the indicated direction with his binoculars. What he discovered were tanks. An entire armada was rolling towards Kapuz. Just then, a small group broke away from there and headed straight for Hill 218. Enemy tanks, about 20 of them, are heading straight towards us, Huebner told his first lieutenant. The officer also climbed onto the gun and aimed at the tanks. An alarm was immediately given, but it was no longer necessary because at that very moment, the English artillery opened fire on the 88, which they had apparently measured exactly beforehand. However, most of the shots went over the battery positions. The 88 had received what it deserved, as it had earned its versatile nickname Battleaxe. Meanwhile, 30 enemy tanks had been identified advancing towards Hill 208. When they had come within 1,000 meters, all 4 guns of the 3rd Battery opened fire. All 4 shells hit their targets, and the enemy tank formation immediately turned away and tried to escape from the area of the deadly 88. The fighting continued, and around 11 o'clock, attacking tanks were sighted again. This time there were about 70 tanks approaching Hill 208. The tanks rolled forward, huddled behind their smoke screens. "Huebner, they look even better from the sand clouds they're stirring up," said the MS man, according to his driving permit. First Lieutenant Huebner ordered, "Has the first tank been taken care of?" When he fired, almost 2 seconds passed before a flash of fire shot out of the tank's rear, followed by the tank crashing 3 seconds later. A blow followed, direct hit, called Officer Heinze. Some shells from the protective gun position crashed into the piled-up sand hills in front of it and threw sand into the gunners' necks. Huebner had taken care of the second tank, and by then, the bolt had snapped shut on the breech. The second shot also targeted one of the remaining enemy tanks and took it out. The other guns also hit their targets, and after the first salvo, the remaining tanks retreated and, as usual, fired maliciously beforehand. Later, dust clouds were also seen behind the battery, but to their relief, they were German Panzer, with the 7.5 centimeter short tank gun. They carried out a counterattack, which provided some relief, albeit only for a short time. In the early afternoon, the English attacked Hill 208 in 2 assault groups. "Now it's time to shoot faster," said Heinze. One of the assault groups, consisting of 40 tanks, approached from the right flank, while the second, with about 20 tanks, moved directly towards the hill. This time, the order to fire was given at a distance of 800 meters. Immediately, all 4 guns started firing. The 88 shell from gun Anton tore apart the nearest enemy with the first shot. Huebner remained calm, seemingly forgetting everything except counting and hitting. The tanks rolled through the thickly swirling dust like shadows. Their bright muzzle flashes indicated to the men behind the 88s where the enemy was. A hit landed close to Huebner's gun. The shot came from the left. The barrel was turned, and before this tank could fire a second shot, Huebner had already fired, with the same result as before. The enemy tank was destroyed. Further to the left, now at a distance of 4 meters, another tank approached gun Anton. Huebner turned and aimed at one of the 2 enemy tanks firing there, while gun Bruno targeted the second. Both tanks were destroyed with a single shot each. Arnold Huebner wiped the sweat from his face and tried to dry his eyes, which were filled with tears from the sand, without rubbing the sand. which felt like lashes on his eyes. Into them, another tank group approached later. It crashed into the rocks, scattering stone and steel fragments. Then suddenly, machine gun fire erupted. One of the ammunition carriers, who had been tirelessly hauling, fell to the ground. Not 100 meters away from the action, a Mach 4 emerged from the ground, its machine gun spewing flames. The shells slammed into the protection of the gun. Huebner feverishly entered the values and squeezed the trigger spring. The shot and impact merged together. The tank shell, it was the X-1, raced out of the turret. That was the fifth tank that the battery had fired on in West Prussia that day. The enemy wanted to scatter in all directions. "Shoot down the two trying to escape to the west," ordered Lieutenant Huebner. All three guns that were still operational fired. The tanks only managed to advance about 800 meters before they were hit in their tracks and engines and came to a burning halt. The crews jumped out and took cover. Two more tanks headed east. However, about 1,000 meters ahead, the fourth gun was positioned, and now received the order to fire and shot down the two tanks. For a while there was a deceptive calm before the next storm. The men were still counting the enemy tanks, the shots fired by the enemy's weapons, and the shots fired by their own through binoculars. Lieutenant Huebner counted 17 tanks destroyed in this attack. Then, from a distance of about 3,000 meters, several advancing enemy tanks were spotted on the flank, and the three guns on the hill opened fire. They shot down 3 or 4 tanks, and the enemy retreated. However, in the afternoon, about 85 enemy tanks were sighted, preparing to attack. They were already firing shots from a great distance, when suddenly the entire 5th Regiment, except for the colonel, appeared in a wadi and caused the English tanks to retreat. The enemy withdrew after a short exchange of fire, and by evening, the decision had been made. In the British General Staff Report published in 1958 by the Majesty's Stationery Office, it stated about this Operation Batlax, which had begun hopefully, failed because it was not possible to capture the crucial Halfayapass position and bypass German Base 208. The bravery and firepower of the defenders were too great. The German 88 proved to be a deadly weapon against all British tank types. The combination of tanks with flak batteries positioned far forward was a surprise and an important factor in the defeat for the British Army. Here, British Bristol bombers attacked repeatedly. Within a few days, Huebner managed to shoot down 3 English bombers. In September, the West Bronze Fest found that he had already been in Africa for 7.5 months. As he reported to his parents, the successes of the 8th Battery of Flak Regiment 33 continued to grow. Soon, it became the most successful flak battery in Africa. The Crusader Offensive, November 18, 1941. The British Army launched the new Crusader Offensive. Churchill announced the night before the attack on the BBC in London. The Desert Army will write a new page in history, and it will be written in blood. Nearly 1,000 tanks from the British Army began this offensive with a rapid advance. Rommel had 500 armored vehicles to counter them, but the flak was also present. The band of the 21st Panzer Division, including the RD Battery of Flak Regiment 33, moved towards the Halfayapass and fought with the enemy for 8 days. Here it became a decisive tank-busting weapon. When I approached the battery near the Egyptian border, it suddenly found itself facing 16 enemy tanks, standing about 3,000 meters away. With great speed, they approached to within 1,600 meters, and the battery commander ordered fire. The guns rolled forward, overtook the English tanks, which had taken cover beside and behind the tanks, jumped up, and called fire. Like a tank race, Zimmer, firing from the chassis, arrived at this enemy. Huebner shot the first guard, and one of the enemies caught fire. His loader fell dead with the second tank shell. Huebner shot the first guard, killing him, and one of the enemies caught fire. His loader fell dead with the second tank shell. The machine gun salvo hit him accurately, and as a result, the gunner jumped in and fired the next shell into the ammunition storage, then a second time, and then again a fourth time. 4 enemy tanks stood burning in the desert. As the foremost gun, they were also able to destroy the 5th, 6th, and 7th tanks. It took 2 shots for the 8th tank, despite the short distance, but this enemy had rotated away in time. Then, hits struck the towing vehicles. "Take cover," shouted the battery commander as the enemy opened fire, but they were still in front of their own tanks and the other guns, which now broke out to the side and opened fire from the flames. The 388s fired as much as they could. Not a single one of the 16 tanks made it. 8 of them were credited to Huebner, who, after an artillery battery that he had eliminated, had shot down 24 enemy tanks with his gun. During the retreat, in December 1941, the 3rd battery was lost in the fire of the advancing enemy guns. The 2nd and 1st batteries, defending at the Halfayapass with Morbach the pastor, were lost there in January 1942. The 1st Division of Fragment 33 was the first unit to be withdrawn from Africa. According to Huebner, he spent his leave in his father's old and new homeland in Bromberg. Here, on March 7, 1942, he received the news that General Rommel had recommended him for the Knight's Cross of the Iron Cross. During a long leave, Huebner was ordered to attend an officer training course at Andy Flak Battery School in Stolpmünde. There, they wanted to show him, of all people, how to shoot down enemy tanks. However, he was soon suspended from participating in this course and transferred to Zwickau due to a leg fracture. Hauptmann Hans KMML, the Lion of Kaputhe, visited him there to personally thank him for his help in the battle. He was then transferred to Bromberg for further recovery. Once recovered, the West Prussian became an instructor with Flak Abteilung 9. There he was promoted to non-commissioned officer. He was subsequently transferred to France with this unit. With the start of the attacks on western France, Flak Abteilung 9 was deployed in ground combat wherever it was needed. Under Huebner's command, as part of an infantry battle group, they showed what their guns could do in the following days. At a distance of about 3,500 meters, he opened fire on 4 Sherman tanks, attacking the battle group. On the 11th shot, one of the tanks burst into flames, and the others retreated in panic. These tanks had their first encounter with the 88. In a series of changing assignments against the division, they managed to prevent the guns from being destroyed near the Loire. The guns were supposed to be blown up, but this rescue of the 88 became a rescue for a battalion of the division when it destroyed several heavy machine guns beyond the bridge and shot up some enemy-occupied houses. That was how the quarters made it through the gate. Huebner had his final deployment in France. He was pulled out with the remnants of the regiment and transferred to Halle as a weapons instructor. After that, he was ordered to the war school in Kitzingen. There, he spent Christmas and New Year's Eve with his comrades. After successfully completing the war school, he was transferred to Flak Replacement Abteilung in Koblenz, and one day before the Americans arrived, he was transferred from there to Nuremberg. His entire battery was organized with him in Nuremberg. They were ordered to defend the city completely with the existing flak on all the main roads. One of 288 would be set up, covered with branches, and a trench built as camouflage. When the city was attacked, Huebner showed what he was capable of. The shots fired by the 88 hit the attacking fighter bombers. They lost 7 planes, and several others withdrew. Then Nuremberg was also surrounded. With 40 soldiers from his battery, Huebner, who had received his promotion to 2nd lieutenant a few days earlier, broke out again and led them south of Ingolstadt. As a forward observer for a 10.5 centimeters battery, he directed these heavy guns. Not less than 10 out of 6 attempts by the Americans to cross the Danube were foiled. Then they had to retreat here as well. They traveled south through Freising and Erding. On May 15, 1945, Lieutenant Huebner was captured by American troops but released home after a few weeks. The war was over. Arnold Huebner worked his way up to the position of an electrical foreman, for which he had to go back to school. He later passed away in Gelsenkirchen.